I know there are times where patients feel alone or they have friends and family who don't understand or maybe aren't as kind in their comments. But there is a big community out there who gets it and wants to be there and support you.
Welcome to the Surrogacy Scoop, a podcast brought to you by Patriot Conceptions, where we demystify the world of surrogacy from the clinical, family, and surrogate perspective. Today, I'm joined by Alease Barnes, an experienced embryologist specializing in assisted reproductive technology, or ART, who works closely with intended parents, surrogates, and fertility doctors to support successful IVF procedures. Alease performs advanced procedures such as ICSI, or intracytoplasmic sperm injection, embryo biopsies for genetic testing and vitrification, or embryo freezing. Welcome to the show, Alease.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I am so excited to dig into your career today, hear about all your expertise. Let's take a step back a little bit, maybe introduce yourself to our audience, and tell us about your journey into this field to where you are today as an embryologist.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like CJ said, my name's Elise. I've been in the field a little over 6 years now. We're actually pushing 7 at this point, which is crazy. I did my undergrad degree at NC State and I studied genetics and biotechnology. I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I had an interest in reproductive health, women's health, and I wanted to be in the lab. So I just literally did some Google searching and was like, what can I do with my degree? I feel like everyone does that. Found embryology. I was like, I think this is a really good fit for me. So in my last semester of undergrad, I was actually able to shadow at a local practice, and then they hired me on full time when I graduated. So I did all of my training on the job. And then the last couple years is when I started my Instagram and TikTok, which is where I really like to kind of dive a little bit deeper for patients and give them a better understanding of what we do in the lab.
It's it's so interesting learning about all the different aspects of this industry, how many, just different fields there are, or maybe different specialties that people have. So I'm super excited to dig a little bit deeper today. You mentioned at the tail end there your social media presence and walking people through the lab. Could you maybe walk us through maybe just a typical day in the lab or the main steps involved in preparing and cultivating embryos?
Yeah, absolutely. So we typically get started fairly early. So I'm usually in the lab by 7 o'clock or so. We always start with QC, which is quality control. That is where we test all of the equipment, the gas levels, the temperature, the humidity, the pH, all of the equipment to make sure that it's running properly, it's within normal ranges, and then we can get started with all of our lab work. So usually procedures like warming embryos for transfer, egg retrievals are done earlier in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we are doing procedures that we can do kind of on our own time. So inseminations, genetic testing, PGT, embryo biopsy for genetic testing, and then prepping for the next day. So charting, dish prep, all of those things we do in the afternoon. And that's typically when we also give patients a call or send them an email updating them on, how their embryos are doing in the lab.
So, from your perspective or your job in the lab, are you interacting with patients directly?
It depends a lot on the lab. I would say most of our interaction is at procedure times. So we're
Mm.
talking to patients before an egg retrieval, before an embryo transfer to do what's called a timeout. This is when we're in the room, the patient's in the room, the physician's in the room, and I'm saying, can you tell me your name and date of birth, what you're here for? Do you have any questions? This is what we're going to be doing today. Make sure everyone is on the same page and then we start a procedure. There's often times where we give patients calls in the afternoon, like I said, to update them on their embryos in the lab. But those are kind of our two main points of communication with patients.
It's so interesting, and maybe this is just coming from surrogacy and the world of, alternate family planning and family building. There's so many different people that you come in contact with that I think that is a pretty big misconception in this whole, you know, industry is that you really are forming a lot of connections and you're putting your trust into a lot of different people's hands at many stages throughout the process.
No, I agree. And I think a lot of patients don't really know who we are, what we do, because we have more limited contact with patients than like a nurse or a physician or the front desk
Mhm.
would. So I really saw that education lacking just because they don't get as much time with us to ask questions and have that conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The educational piece. And I mean, that's how we got connected here today. You're doing so much educational work. So maybe let's kind of jump right back into that again. What are some maybe specific protocols or techniques that ensure optimal health and viability for embryos?
So, really, the biggest thing is environment for embryo development. We want to have the optimal environment. So, we're having state of the art incubation, state of the art media, and making sure all of our processes are as efficient and top notch and researched as possible. There's a lot of research that goes into why we do what we do, and there's always more and more research coming out. So, we really try to stay on top of that, making sure we're using the best media, following best practices, improving our techniques in terms of what we have control over in the lab. Unfortunately, we don't have control over everything, but we do our
Mhm.
best to make sure the things that we can control are really optimized for patient success.
What are maybe some of those challenges that, with trying to get the ideal environment? What are some of the challenges that come up there?
Yeah, so one that's fairly common is location. So people don't always think about that, but the lab environment in somewhere like Miami that's really warm and humid is very different than somewhere like Denver, Colorado that is dry and the altitude is different. So we really have to change kind of the lab environment in those locations to make sure that we're still providing, optimal pH, optimal temperature and humidity. So we may, like in Miami, we may have to have a dehumidifier. In Denver, we may have to have a humidifier and change the settings on our incubators to manipulate the gas in environments like that.
Wow, that's really interesting. I honestly didn't even consider that. And I imagine something that's what patients wouldn't really consider either. When, let's say a patient is, for one reason or another, their embryos are going to be something that is processed through your lab. Is that patient generally local? Do you have patients from all over the country, all over the world?
Yeah, so patients most of the time patients are fairly local, but there are practices that are more known for their, patients that travel to them. So some of the top practices have patients that will fly from all over the country, all over the world to seek care there. But in general, most patients are fairly local, but some will travel if they're looking for a very specific treatment plan or maybe a physician who specializes in their specific case or their specific diagnosis. So there's definitely some traveling that goes along.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. The reach of fertility is so wide. And yeah, someone might be more comfortable locally, someone might find somebody that they want to go to specifically. So it's really interesting. And there's so many unique challenges that come up, like you mentioned.
Mhm. Yeah, and we didn't even get into, like, insurance coverage, that also plays a role, and where patients go and affordability. I know that's a really can be really challenging for patients, so that plays a role in where they decide to get care for sure.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. I think the episode before this, if I remember the timeline correctly, we were speaking with a lawyer and health insurance and coverage in many different phases and many different states of if you this is a surrogacy, how crucial that is and how different it is. And healthcare plans are one of those things that change, most of the time on a year to year basis. And so, yeah, that accessibility, I imagine, is just another challenge added on to this.
Yeah, for sure.
So, maybe kind of as we continue down our day in the life, or, a little bit of a lab exploration here, could you explain to us maybe how you select the healthiest embryos for implantation, and what are the factors that you consider in that process?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that we're looking at when we're selecting an embryo for transfer. Kind of the first thing is genetic normalcy. So if a patient has done PGTA testing, which is genetic testing for aneuploidy, things like Down syndrome, trisomy 18, things that happen during the growth of the embryo. If a patient has chosen to do that testing, we're going to look at that report first. So we want to choose an embryo that has come back as euploid or genetically normal. We're going to omit the ones that are abnormal, and then we're going to choose an embryo based on its grade. And so we grade embryos based on what they look like. We can look at the different parts of the embryo and give them a grade based on how good they look, essentially. And then we are using that grade as a selection tool to choose the best embryo for transfer. Unfortunately, we can't guarantee which embryo is going to make a baby. There's a lot of research going into that, and hopefully, newer technologies that will help us with that selection. So right now, our best option in terms of selection is grade and genetic normalcy are the kind of the two big things that we're choosing, that we're looking at when we're choosing an embryo for transfer.
You mentioned the testing that you do on the embryos before you're looking at them. What is that process? Would that be called an embryo biopsy?
Yeah, so that's an embryo biopsy. So when the embryo is a blastocyst, so on day 5, 6, or 7 of culture, we can take 5 to 7 cells from the part of the embryo that's going to become the placenta. We can actually see the difference by looking at the embryo. So we take those cells from the embryo and send those cells to a genetic testing company, and their lab, you know, lyses the cells to get out the DNA, amplifies that DNA, and then sequences that DNA to tell us if that embryo has normal chromosomes or not.
That's so interesting. I guess the first thing that comes to mind in that is the safety of the embryo. How is that ensured throughout this process?
Yeah, so embryologists, that is embryo biopsy is one of the most technical procedures that embryologists do. So only fully trained, highly skilled embryologists are performing that procedure. With everything that we do in the lab, there is a risk of damaging an embryo. The risk is really low because, like I said, we're fairly well trained. People have been doing this for a long time now. And so we're really making sure that the cells that we take are healthy and that we're not damaging the embryo in the process. There's some great research out that looks at embryo biopsy and if it impacts pregnancy rates. So the actual physical removing of the cells, does that negatively impact pregnancy rates? And the research is showing us that it doesn't. So the embryos are a little more hardy than people think. I know people who watch my content, if they ever see an embryo biopsy, which I have on my page, they're like, oh my gosh, it looks so violent. And I'm like, it does look very violent. But the research is telling us that the embryos are hardy and they're not damaged in this process, and they're able to really recover very well from a process like this. So risk is fairly low. The other thing is embryos have a lot of cells. So when we're taking 5 to 7 cells from an embryo that has 100 to 150 cells, it's a fairly
Mm.
small percentage of the cells that we're removing from the embryo.
That's a that's a really good point. And I think that, well, with this, and you mentioned at the beginning of this that you send them out to another lab for doing that genetic testing. In that genetic testing, is that all fairly standard? Is there elective things that people, might want to know about the embryos that they wouldn't in other situations? I guess talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so genetic testing is actually optional. It's not something that patients all across the board have to do. It's something that I would definitely recommend talking to your physician about if you're interested in it. It shows benefit for patients of a certain demographic who are over the age of 35. 35 is when we start to see that rate of abnormality increase. So as we age, our bodies are not as good at repairing abnormal DNA or separating chromosomes correctly. So we see that increase in aneuploidy or abnormality over the age of 35. And so those are patients who may benefit from PGT testing. Definitely something to talk with your doctor about.
That's interesting. And so then when, let's say somebody does do that testing, those results come back to you, are you or your team or your lab, are you the people that would communicate those results, or is that on the other lab?
So the testing lab gives us the results. It gives the clinic that created the embryos the results. And typically that conversation is had with the physician and with the genetic counselor. So genetic counselors play a really big role in that process because they're the ones who have the expertise to talk about the very specific abnormalities and genetic testing, what that means in terms of pregnancy rates or a future child. So it's kind of a combination of a couple people who are giving those results to the patient and talking to them about what next steps would be.
Kind of jumping off of that almost perfect segue. You mentioned there's a lot of collaboration in this. You're working with physicians, you're working with genetic counselors. Maybe in what ways do you collaborate with those fertility specialists or genetic counselors to make informed decisions about the embryo selection or implantation?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work very closely with a lot of different professionals in the field. So genetic counselors, we're talking with about a patient's genetic testing report. So they may say, oh, this embryo in particular, we don't think is good for transfer because of XYZ reasons. We're collaborating closely with the physicians. If we see something in the lab that may be concerning or gives us more information about a patient's diagnosis, we want to make sure we're having that conversation with the physician so they can tailor treatment plans specifically to that patient. So, for example, there are a lot of times where everything looks good until things get to the lab. And then we're seeing morphological abnormalities in eggs, which gives us a concern that maybe the patient has an egg quality issue, or we're seeing sperm that doesn't look that great, or we're seeing a abnormal drop off in embryo growth or arrest in development. So all of those things are things that we're taking note of and making sure we are relaying to the physician so that they can have a further conversation about what does that mean for my treatment.
Hmm. That's the first thing that comes to mind when you say that is the communication piece, how you translate these, you know, really scientific, really specific, even and really unique situations to patients and all the kind of steps it goes through there. In what ways are, how much of that is on you? How much of that is on genetic counselors? And maybe what is that collaboration level like for someone in your position?
Yeah, so ultimately, embryologists are not medical providers, so we cannot offer medical advice. So oftentimes we are more behind the scenes. So we're the ones who are talking to genetic counselors. A genetic counselor may say, "Hey, this embryo the DNA from this embryo didn't amplify. Can you give us a little bit more information about what happened in the lab? Maybe did you note something about the embryo quality or something like that?" And so we're kind of more behind the scenes, and then because they have the accreditation and the ability to give medical advice, they're the ones who are then, making a decision with the patient and giving them that medical advice.
That's so interesting. And something that comes up in all of these conversations that we're having on the podcast is just how unique each patient situation is or how unique each journey is. I imagine at your level, you're, obviously a very specialized profession. You're doing the same things, or at least, kind of working with the same things. But even then, I imagine that those abnormalities that come up, those are unique challenges and things that, you're still kind of working on your feet with.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time to be trained, and that's for good reason. So we don't want an embryologist just to know how to do the procedures. The hard part and the expertise comes in when they know how to troubleshoot. So it's not good enough to just know how to do something when everything is perfect because that's not reality, right? We're typically working, under pressure. Things may not be exactly, perfect all the time. And so that expertise comes with time, which is why embryologists have been doing this for a very long time and they're very well skilled because they can troubleshoot when things aren't going perfect and can pivot and make sure things still go smoothly when they're put under that pressure of having things not go exactly how they should.
Wow. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I imagine too that, our listeners who probably like me are hearing about this and many of the intricacies of this industry for the first time. It's so interesting. Maybe talk a little bit about your experience training, if there were any unique situations that you found yourself in, or just some anecdotes from your days kind of working to the point where you are today.
Yeah, I think there's a big misconception about embryologists who train on the job. That's traditionally where most of the embryologists that you are working with in your practice were trained on the job. And so with hearing that, patients are like, "Oh my gosh, you were training on patient gametes on patient cases, and that's not the case. There's actually a lot of things we can do to train when we're not working on patient cases. So the first thing is we often will use animal models to train. So we can use mouse embryos, bovine, which are cows, and hamster eggs to perform all of these procedures and practice all of these procedures before we actually work on patient cases. So we have to, it's very like to the point, like we have to keep track of every single time we've done a biopsy. What was the result? Did it survive? Did it amplify? All of these things, everything has to be logged. And it's all under the supervision of a lab director who, directs the whole lab, has a PhD, and is very skilled, or a senior embryologist who has been doing this for a very long time. We're always under observation. They're giving us tips, they're critiquing us, they're making sure we're doing everything appropriately. And then the other thing we can do is patients often will, a lot of programs have the ability to allow patients to donate unused eggs, sperm, embryos for embryology training. So that was a lot of what I did. Patients had abnormal embryos or they were family complete and had embryos that they wanted to donate to further the training of the embryologist in their practice. And so without patients like that, I wouldn't be trained. They're very grateful for the patients that allowed me to train on their gametes. So that is a lot of the ways that we're able to train. And then once we have, you know, proved competency in all of these procedures, we're still also not ready to work on patient cases. We
Wow.
then start splitting things. So if a patient has 10 eggs, I may inject or inseminate 2 or 3, and the senior embryologist will do the remaining eggs. And so even though I've done all that training up to then, we're still going to slowly incorporate this person into patient cases to make sure our standard of care never drops and that we keep stats on everything. So every single thing that I do, I know the outcome of. We're looking at those stats. How do they compare to the rest of the embryologist, to the rest of the lab? And they have to stay on par. And that continues through your whole career. So every so often, you're looking at the embryologist at your practice and where are they in comparison to our standard? Are there some that need remedial training? Are there some that are doing the best? And everyone should be looking at what they're doing to try to improve their rates. So there's a lot of statistics and training that goes on behind the scenes that's very continuous to ensure that success and standards are always being met.
That is so fascinating. It really sounds like they put you through the gauntlet to make sure that
Yeah,
everybody is, yeah,
but rightfully
completely up to
so.
par.
This is important stuff. So
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's so fascinating to hear about I don't want to say trials, but maybe just the journey that you have to take to get to where you are today. And this is across so many different facets of this, surrogacy specific journey that we're kind of doing deep dives here for. So, really grateful. Thank you for sharing all of that. That
of
was so
course,
interesting. You mentioned a little bit at the end, but through a lot of the conversations we're having as well, this industry changes so much from so many different facets. Maybe what are some innovative tools or systems that you've seen in embryo freezing and, if they change how you approach your work?
some of the newer technology that I'm seeing utilized more in labs is in equipment and is in kind of data collection and analytics. So AI is kind of the first one. So everyone in every industry at this point is trying to incorporate AI in some way. They're creating all of these different AI softwares. How can we use them to improve our business, improve success, improve all these things? And so the IVF and the reproductive health field is doing the exact same thing. So I talked about how right now we don't know exactly which embryo is going to make a baby. Right? So AI is trying to solve that problem. There are people working with AI software to try to improve selection for embryo transfer. So the research is still out, it's still ongoing. I wouldn't say that there is an AI software out there right now that's really showing an improvement in pregnancy rates, but I do think it will get there. And there are some that are afraid that, oh my gosh, AI is going to take our jobs. But I really think it's a tool that we will be able to use to help improve patient success. So that's kind of the first one. The other thing is incubation. and that's specifically time-lapse incubation. So currently now for us to assess an embryo, we have to take it out of the incubator. We have to take the dish out of the incubator and look at it under a microscope. And so the incubator environment is very different than the ambient air environment. And so we've already shown that that causes a little stress in the embryos. We don't want to remove them from the incubator at all. We do want to do it as little as possible. And so time lapse incubation allows us to view the development of the embryo without having to take it out of the incubator. And then that's where they're getting the data to analyze for artificial intelligence and selection tools. So it's given us so much more information than we used to have because on average, what before time-lapse incubation, we were taking the embryo out of the incubator and looking at it 3, maybe 4 times. Now with time-lapse incubation, we're getting a picture of that embryo every 10 minutes. And so we can kind of look at the video. We're learning a lot more about embryo development. Is this embryo doing something developmentally that isn't ideal? What is ideal? What is a red flag when we're looking at embryo development? We're learning a lot of stuff, and a lot of that is thanks to time-lapse incubation. So a lot of labs are starting to incorporate that. Also, patients typically like it because they get a flash drive with like a video of their embryo. I don't know if you've seen any of those, but
Oh, wow.
they're really cool of the embryo going from a fertilized egg all the way to a blastocyst. It's pretty cool. I love watching them. I think they're so cool. So it's definitely some technology that's being implemented kind of throughout the country and throughout the world, and we'll continue to see that grow, I believe.
Wow. I mean, both of those kind of developments that you just described sound kind of crazy, kind of awesome. It's so interesting how quick because I completely agree. AI is being implemented in so many ways, and it's crazy how fast it is. But I really similarly to what you were describing, how quickly it's able to help people and how quickly it's able to optimize things that at one point were, could have been a strain or could have been a risk factor. Obviously, we don't want to put 100% faith into anything like that yet, but it's so interesting and I find it so curious. That's surprisingly something that hasn't really come up on the podcast yet, and I've been waiting for an opportunity to talk about it. So interesting. When you think of new developments, obviously, I assume you are very busy between your job and then all the social media work that you're doing in education. But how do you stay up to date with those changes in this field?
There are a lot of ways that embryologists stay up to date with new information. So, a lot of it is research based. There's new papers that are coming out all the time, but a lot of practices have journal clubs. So, once a month or once a quarter, key players in the clinic, so physicians, nurses, lab staff get together and someone presents a study that they recently read, and they talk about the research. Was it a good study? What could have been improved? Is this something that we want to follow up on? Is this something that makes a difference in our practice? And a lot of clinics do that. I think it's great to have that kind of always having someone looking at the new research and having a conversation about it, because that's the only way that we know to implement new techniques or new technologies is by someone kind of reading up on it and seeing what's out there. The other thing that's really helpful is conferences. So that's where like the latest and greatest research is being presented is at conferences. So many embryologists, physicians, lab directors, nurses are attending regular conferences. There are a handful throughout the year. I have met y'all on many occasions at ASRM. So some great conferences throughout the country, and some even go out to Europe to their big conference every year. So it's a great way to collaborate with people you don't get to see all of the time, see the new research that's being done, maybe even learn new techniques. A lot of clinics have hands-on workshops where, hey, let's use a time-lapse incubator, get familiar with it, learn how to make the dishes, learn about this new media. And so it's a great way to kind of see all of the new things that are out there.
Wow, that's so interesting. Yeah, again, there's just so many facets to this, so many, like a million, honestly, different rabbit holes we could go down right now. But you have mentioned quite a few times, and I do want to at least share with our audience a little bit about your social media, the education you're doing. So maybe talk to us a little bit about, the specifics, where people can find you, and then also maybe some of your goals and the educational content that you're trying to create there.
Yeah, absolutely. So my goal, well, I'll tell you about how I started my pages. That'll help a little bit. So at the time, I was one of the only full-time embryologists at my practice, and so I was fielding a lot of the same questions from patients. And I was thinking, goodness, if our patients have these same questions over and over, it can't just be them. It has to be patients everywhere that are having these same questions. And there's got to be a better way to inform people of what's going on here. And so I decided to create my Instagram page and TikTok to really dive deeper into the lab because we're so behind the scenes and we don't see patients face to face as much as physicians and doctors. There's a lot of mystery around what we do in the lab, and I really wanted to demystify things and give patients the education that they need to have informed discussions with their providers. Physicians are very busy, and so they don't always have 2 hours, 3 hours. I'm telling you, there's so much information about the lab. They don't have all the time to explain every single little thing, what it looks like, what does this mean for your cycle? And so I wanted a place where patients could go and get that information. And so for me, that was showing what we do, like actually showing, here is me sitting at a hood. This is what it looks like when I am freezing an embryo. This is what it looks like when an embryo is being biopsied, when we do ICSI, when we do all of these different things. And I really wanted to show patients as much as I could. And so that's where I started it. It's been a couple years now, and it's been really awesome. And I've really enjoyed all of the patients that I've met and all of the other professionals that I've met who are also on social media, really trying to put good educational content out there. So if y'all are ever wanting to see what an embryo biopsy looks like, or an insemination or an egg retrieval, y'all can find me at Alease the Embryologist on Instagram and TikTok. And I'm also right in the middle of my own egg freezing journey. So if you're ever curious about egg freezing, you can check that out. I start injections pretty soon, so it'll be exciting stuff.
Awesome. Well, we will absolutely include links to everything in the show notes, your upcoming journey. I'm very excited to keep up with that. That sounds very interesting. And I'm sure that will interest our audience as well. Maybe kind of close us out here today. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience, mostly of people who are very interested in surrogacy from very various different aspects, interested in becoming a surrogate, interested in egg donation, or interested in as intended parents? Anything you want to share from your perspective as an embryologist?
Yeah, I think just in general, my biggest thing is that you're not alone in your desires to build a family how you want. There I have joined the community on social media, and it's very warm and welcoming and so, so supportive. I know there are times where patients feel alone or they have friends and family who don't understand or maybe aren't as kind in their comments. But there is a big community out there who gets it and wants to be there and support you. And so I know it can be hard to find those people. I just want anyone who's listening to know that they're not alone. There are others who are thinking of you and wishing you the best.
Awesome. Well, I think that is the perfect way to close this out. Thank you so much for all your time today, Alease. Literally $1,000,000 a minute here. So we're very thankful to have you on the show here. And again, all of Alease's social media and, links to all that stuff will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you on the next episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Surrogacy Scoop, and I hope you found value in this meaningful conversation. For all resources mentioned in the episode, or to connect with Patriot Conceptions online, visit the description. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast hosting platform, and share this episode with those in your life who may be interested in getting involved.